Marcus Williams stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his bow tie with trembling fingers, while his heart pounded with the nervous excitement that only a wedding day could bring. And outside the window of the historic Magnolia Garden estate, 200 white chairs stood arranged in perfect rows, as purple and gold ribbons danced in the warm spring breeze, creating a scene so beautiful it could have been painted by an artist. But for Marcus, this moment meant so much more than just beauty, because 40 years ago, his parents couldn't have even walked through these gardens as guests. Yet here he stood, not just as a groom, but as the mayor of Riverside, ready to marry the woman who had stood by him through death threats and sleepless nights and endless city council meetings. And as his mother, Eleanor, entered the room with tears streaming down her face, she whispered that his father would have been so proud, her weathered hands straightening, his boutonniere with the gentle touch that had comforted him through every challenge of his life. And Marcus could hear the jazz quartet beginning to play outside as guests arrived from every corner of his life. From city council members to teachers from Jasmine's inner-city school, to his fraternity brothers who had supported his unlikely political journey. And through the window, he caught a glimpse of Jasmine's cousin from Atlanta, warming up her powerful, gospel voice for the ceremony. But across the street, behind lace curtains that had hidden decades of prejudice, Margaret Hutchinson watched with growing anger as what she saw as an invasion of her pristine neighborhood unfolded before her eyes. Her 70 years of carefully maintained bias boiling over as she counted the black faces gathering in what she considered her territory. And her manicured fingers reached for her phone with the practiced ease of someone who had made similar calls before, though never with stakes this high. And as she dialed 911, she crafted her words carefully, speaking of disturbances and suspicious activity and fear for her safety, never explicitly mentioning race, but painting a picture she knew would bring the police quickly, describing crowds that were unruly, and music that was too loud, and behavior that seemed threatening, all while the actual scene across the street showed families embracing, and children in their Sunday best, and elderly grandmothers being helped to their seats with loving care. But Margaret's fear-clouded eyes saw only what generations of learned hatred had trained them to see. And as she hung up the phone with a satisfied smile, she had no idea that she had just set in motion a confrontation that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in that garden. Because Marcus Williams was not just any groom, and this was not just any wedding. And as he stood at the altar, watching his young nieces scatter rose petals down the aisle while the music shifted to the wedding march, he saw Jasmine appear at the garden entrance like a vision in white silk and lace, her father beaming beside her with the pride of a man who had worked 3 jobs to put his daughter through college. And Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat, because this woman had been his anchor through everything. The one who reminded him why he fought so hard for change in their city, the one who held him when the weight of being the first black mayor became too heavy to bear alone. And as Pastor Robinson began to speak about love conquering all boundaries and building bridges where others would build walls, his words carried across the garden with the power of truth spoken from experience. For he had marched with Dr. King, and had seen both the worst and best of humanity. And just as Marcus began to speak his vows, the words he had practiced 100 times, but which still made his voice crack with emotion, the air was suddenly pierced by sirens, not 1 or 2 but multiple police cars, their wailing growing louder and louder until 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the estate's entrance with lights flashing like violent strobes against the peaceful scene, and the music stopped mid-note as every head turned toward the commotion. And Marcus felt Jasmine's hand tightened in his, as whispers rippled through the crowd, like waves of fear, because every black person there knew that police, arriving at their gatherings rarely meant anything good. And some of the elderly guests began to tremble with memories of other times, when celebrations had turned to tragedy, when joy had been stolen by those who claimed to protect and serve. And as 6 officers exited their vehicles, with hands resting on their equipment belts, their faces set in the hard expressions of those expecting trouble, Marcus squeezed Jasmine's hand and whispered that everything would be okay, even as his jaw clenched with an anger he couldn't show. Not here, not now, not when 200 people were looking to him for leadership. And as he stepped away from the altar, his groomsmen moved to follow, but he raised his hand to stop them, because he knew that multiple black men approaching police could escalate everything, and so he walked alone down that petal-strewn aisle with the same measured dignity that had carried him through hostile city council meetings, and death threats, and moments when being a black mayor meant carrying not just his own dreams, but the dreams of an entire community on his shoulders. And behind him, phones appeared in hands as guests began recording, knowing instinctively that whatever happened next would need to be documented. would need to be witnessed, would need to be remembered. While Margaret Hutchinson watched from her window with a mixture of satisfaction and growing unease, not yet understanding that she had just lit a fuse that would explode not into the chaos she expected, but into something far more powerful, a moment of transformation that would strip away pretense and prejudice and leave only truth standing in that garden. Because destiny has a way of bringing people exactly where they need to be, and on this spring afternoon, in this garden where love was supposed to conquer all, history was about to be written in a way no one could have imagined. The lead officer, Sergeant David Meyer, approached with determined steps that crunched against the gravel path, while wedding guests parted like a sea of silk and satin, creating a corridor of tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, and Marcus continued walking toward him with his head held high even as his mind raced through possibilities and protocols and the horrible irony that he, the mayor who had worked so hard to reform police-community relations, was now facing his own officers at his own wedding, and behind him Jasmine stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she watched her future husband walk toward what could become a disaster, while Pastor Robinson gripped his Bible tighter and began to pray silently, having lived through enough history to know how quickly joy could turn to sorrow when black celebrations met police intervention. And Sergeant Meyer's face was set in stone as he began to speak, his voice carrying across the silent garden, where even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "Sir, we received a report of an unruly gathering, with suspicious activity and potential criminal behavior." But as the words left his mouth, his eyes finally focused on the man before him, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow, causing him to stumble over his next words as his brain struggled to reconcile the complaint he'd received with the reality before him. "Mayor Williams," he gasped, and the other 5 officers shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving away from their equipment belts as they suddenly saw the scene through different eyes. Saw the wedding arch decorated with fresh flowers, saw the bride in her white dress standing at the altar, saw the pastor in his ceremonial robes, saw the elderly grandmothers in their church hats, saw the children in their tiny tuxedos and flower girl dresses, saw the professional photographers capturing what should have been perfect moments, and the weight of their mistake began to crush down on them like a mountain of shame. But Marcus stood tall, his voice steady despite the fury burning in his chest as he responded. "Sergeant Meyer, as you can see, this is my wedding ceremony, for which we filed all proper permits with the city 3 months ago, permits that went through my own office, with security arrangements approved by your department, and sound levels that are well within legal limits." And Meyer's face flushed red as he removed his hat, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of profound embarrassment. "Sir, I apologize. We received a call about a disturbance. The caller said there were hundreds of people acting aggressively, blocking traffic, causing property damage." And Marcus interrupted gently, but firmly. "I can imagine exactly what the caller said, and I think we both know why they said it. Don't we, Sergeant?" And the question hung in the air like an accusation that needed no further explanation. While from her window, Margaret Hutchinson watched with growing horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake, her hands beginning to shake as she saw officers removing their hats in what looked like apology, and Jasmine had moved from the altar now, walking down the aisle in her wedding dress that rustled like whispered prayers, her chin raised with the dignity that her ancestors had fought and died to pass down to her, and she slipped her hand into Marcus's hand, standing beside him as a united front that made several officers look away in shame because they could see what they had almost destroyed, what fear and prejudice had almost stolen from this community. And behind them, the wedding guests remained frozen in a tableau of witnesses to history, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with jaws clenched in anger, and Marcus's mother Eleanor stood with her hand over her heart, remembering her own wedding 50 years ago when the police had come then to bet for different reasons, with different intentions, with violence instead of embarrassment. And here was her son facing the same system, but from a different position of power, yet still vulnerable, still black, still subject to the assumptions that could turn celebration into confrontation. And Sergeant Meyer's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the silence with information that made everything worse. "Unit 12, be advised. The event at Magnolia Garden Estate is the Williams-Johnson wedding. Mayor Williams' wedding. City permit number 4521 on file. All permissions granted. Security cleared." And the words echoed across the garden, confirming what everyone already knew, that this was a false call. A malicious report, an act of racial prejudice dressed up as civic concern. and one of the younger officers, Officer Patricia Chen, who had just joined the force and who Marcus had personally welcomed to the department, looked like she might cry from the shame of it all, while the eldest officer, Detective Franklin, who was just months from retirement and had seen too much in his 30 years on the force, shook his head with disgust at how nothing seemed to change. And Marcus felt the weight of the moment, not just as a groom whose wedding had been interrupted, but as a leader whose response would set the tone for how his community moved forward, would determine whether this became a story of confrontation or transformation. And he could feel the eyes of his constituents upon him, the young black men who looked to him as proof that the system could change, the elderly women who had prayed for him every Sunday since he announced his campaign, the white allies who had supported him despite criticism from their own communities, the children who wore Mayor Marcus t-shirts to school with pride. And he knew that his next words would ripple far beyond this garden, would become part of the narrative of race and power and justice in America. While Margaret Hutchinson picked up her phone again, this time calling her neighbor Barbara to peer out her window, to see what she had done, to witness the chaos she had created. But Barbara's response was not what she expected. "Margaret, what have you done? That's the mayor's wedding. Everyone knew about it. It was in the newspaper. How could you?" And the reality of her actions began to sink in like poison through her veins. The possibility of legal consequences, of public humiliation, of being exposed as the racist she had always denied being. And as she watched the officers standing there with their heads bowed, she realized that her carefully constructed world of superiority and segregation was about to come crashing down around her. While in the garden, Marcus's groomsmen had moved closer, not threateningly, but protectively, a wall of black excellence in their tailored suits, doctors and lawyers and teachers and entrepreneurs who had all faced their own versions of this moment. And the bridesmaids stood with Jasmine's train spread around them like a pool of white defiance against the darkness of prejudice. And in this suspended moment, with police and wedding party facing each other, with love and fear battling for supremacy, with history and future colliding in a garden where dreams were supposed to come true, everyone waited for what would come next, knowing that whatever happened would be remembered, would be talked about, would become part of the story this city told about itself, whether as a moment of shame or a moment of redemption. Marcus stood perfectly still as Sergeant Meyer struggled to find words that could undo what had been done. And the silence stretched between them like a chasm that held decades of pain and mistrust and broken promises. Until finally Meyer spoke. Again, his voice cracking with the weight of his shame. "Mayor Williams, I cannot express how sorry I am. This is inexcusable, unforgivable." And Marcus felt Jasmine's hand squeeze his tighter as she stepped forward slightly, her wedding dress catching the afternoon sun in a way that made her look like an angel of justice, and she spoke for the first time. Her teacher's voice clear and strong despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Officers, do you see what you almost did here today? Do you understand what your presence means to every black family that has gathered here to celebrate love?" And her words cut through the air like a blade of truth, making Officer Chen actually step back as if physically struck by the reality of their actions. While Marcus's grandmother, 93 years old, and a survivor of more racism than anyone should endure in a lifetime, began walking forward with her cane tapping against the ground, and everyone parted for her because she carried history in her bones and wisdom in her eyes. And when she reached the front, she looked up at Sergeant Meyer and said, "Young man, I've seen police break up our gatherings my whole life, from birthday parties to church picnics to funerals, always with the same excuse, always with the same fear. But today you stand before a mayor, a man who represents the very law you claim to enforce, and still you came. Still you believed the worst." And her words made Meyer's face crumble as the full weight of the systemic problem he was part of crashed down upon him. And from across the street Margaret Hutchinson had opened her door and was standing on her porch, drawn by some horrible fascination to witness the destruction she had caused. But what she saw was not chaos, but something far more powerful. Dignity in the face of injustice. Grace where there should be anger. And Marcus raised his hand to quiet the murmuring crowd before speaking again. "Sergeant Meyer, you asked if I want you to investigate the false report, but I have a different request." And everyone leaned in to hear what the mayor would demand, what justice would look like in this moment. And Marcus continued, "I want you and your officers to stay, to witness this wedding, to see who we really are when we're not being viewed through the lens of someone else's fear. To understand that the suspicious activity your caller reported was nothing more than black joy, black love, black excellence, gathering to celebrate." And the request stunned everyone, including the officers who exchanged glances of confusion and shame. And Detective Franklin, the eldest among them, spoke up for the first time. "Mayor Williams, we interrupted your wedding. We don't deserve your grace." But Marcus shook his head. "Detective, grace isn't about what's deserved. It's about what's needed. And what we need is for you to see us. Really see us. Not as threats or problems, but as people celebrating the same milestones you celebrate. Feeling the same joy you feel." And Jasmine added, "And then we need you to remember this moment the next time you get a call about suspicious black people doing normal things." And her words landed with a force of truth that couldn't be denied. While in the crowd, Marcus's campaign manager was already on his phone, knowing this moment would make national news. Knowing the story of a mayor's wedding, interrupted by police, would spark conversations across the country, but also knowing that Marcus's response would be the real story. The choice to educate rather than retaliate, and Margaret Hutchinson began walking across the street, her legs shaking with each step, drawn by guilt and shame and something else. Perhaps the first stirring of recognition that she had been wrong not just today, but for decades. And as she approached the gathering, several guests moved to block her path, their faces hard with justified anger. But Marcus saw her coming, and raised his hand again. "Let her through," he said, though his voice carried no warmth, only the professional courtesy of a leader who understood that this moment was bigger than personal feelings. And Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, her carefully styled hair now disheveled, her makeup running with tears she didn't remember, starting to cry, and she tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat like broken glass, while the officers remained frozen in place, unsure whether to leave or stay, whether to arrest the woman who had made the false report, or to simply disappear and pretend this never happened. But Marcus wouldn't let them off that easily. "Sergeant Meyer, I need you to understand something," he said, his voice carrying now with the authority of his office. "This isn't just about today. This is about every black family that has had their joy interrupted by unfounded fear. Every celebration that has been turned into a confrontation because someone saw black skin and assumed criminality." And Meyer nodded, unable to speak, the weight of his uniform feeling heavier than it ever had before. And Pastor Robinson stepped forward, his Bible still in his hand, and addressed the officers directly. "Gentlemen and lady, you have a choice to make right now. You can either be part of the problem or part of the solution. You can leave here having learned nothing, or you can stay and witness what you almost destroyed, can see the love you almost turned to grief, the joy you almost stole." And Officer Chen was crying now, tears streaming down her young face as she realized how close she had come to being part of something terrible. And she stepped forward, removing her hat and badge, and placing them on a nearby table before saying, "Mayor Williams, Ms. Johnson, I'm off duty now. Not as a statement, but as a guest, if you'll have me, because I need to witness this. Need to be part of something better than what we almost did." And her action broke something in the other officers. And one by one they began removing their hats, not in surrender, but in respect, in recognition, in the beginning of understanding. While Margaret Hutchinson finally found her voice, weak and trembling, but clear. "I'm the one who called," she admitted, and the crowd turned toward her with a collective intake of breath, some stepping forward with anger in their eyes. But Marcus held up both hands. "Everyone stop," he commanded, and they did, because even in this moment of personal pain, he was still their leader, still the man they had elected to guide them through difficult times. And he looked at Margaret with eyes that held disappointment, but also something else. Perhaps pity for a woman so consumed by fear that she would try to destroy something beautiful. And he asked her the only question that mattered: why? And that single word hung in the air like a judgment, waiting for an answer that would either begin redemption or confirm damnation. Margaret Hutchinson stood trembling before 200 pairs of eyes that bore into her soul with the weight of generations of injustice. And her voice cracked as she began to speak. "I was afraid. I've always been afraid. My father taught me to be afraid. My grandfather taught him, and I never questioned it until this very moment when I see what my fear has done." And her confession hung in the air, like a poison that had finally been expelled, while Marcus listened with the patience of a man who had heard every excuse for racism, but never one delivered at his own wedding. And Jasmine stood beside him like a pillar of strength, her wedding dress now seeming like armor against the ugliness that had invaded their sacred day. And Margaret continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken inside her. "Saw all of you gathering, and I didn't see a wedding. I saw my worst fears coming true. I saw my neighborhood changing. I saw everything my family told me to fear, and I made that call because I wanted you gone. wanted you to hurt, wanted you to know you weren't welcome. And several guests gasped at her brutal honesty, while others nodded knowingly, because they had encountered 1,000 Margaret Hutchinsons in their lives. And Marcus's mother Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. Do you know what you almost cost us today? Not just a wedding, but the faith, my son, has worked so hard to build between the police and our community. The trust that takes years to establish and seconds to destroy. And Margaret nodded, her designer dress now wrinkled and stained with tears. I know, I see it now. I see how my fear became your danger, how my prejudice could have become your tragedy. And Sergeant Meyer stepped forward, his notebook in hand, the official weight of his position returning as he addressed Margaret. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a crime, especially when motivated by racial bias. You could face serious charges. But Marcus raised his hand, and everyone waited to see what justice would look like in this moment, whether it would come with handcuffs or something else entirely. And Marcus spoke with the measured tone of someone choosing their words carefully. Mrs. Hutchinson, you have committed a crime not just against the law but against humanity, against the very idea that people can gather and enjoy without being seen as a threat. And he paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But I am not just a victim here, I am the mayor. And I have to think about what serves our community best. What helps us move forward rather than backward. And the crowd stirred, with mixed emotions, some wanting punishment, others curious about what Marcus was thinking, and Jasmine whispered something in his ear, a private moment between bride and groom that reminded everyone this was still supposed to be their wedding day. And Marcus nodded before addressing Margaret again. You have two choices. Mrs. Hutchinson, you can be arrested, charged, and become another statistic in the cycle of punishment. Or you can choose accountability. Real accountability. And Margaret looked up with confusion and hope warring in her eyes. What do you mean? And Marcus explained. You will attend diversity training. Not the corporate kind that people sleep through, but real education about the history of racism in this city. You will volunteer 100 hours at the community center in the neighborhood you feared. You will meet the people you tried to harm, learn their names, their stories, their dreams. And the crowd murmured with surprise at this unexpected response. While Detective Franklin spoke up, Mayor Williams, with all due respect. That seems lenient for what she did, but Marcus turned to him, with fire in his eyes. Detective, do you think jail time will change her heart? Do you think a fine will make her see us as human? Or do you think maybe, just maybe, proximity and education might do what punishment never could? And his words carried the weight of every civil rights leader who had chosen love over hate. Education over retaliation. And Margaret was sobbing now. Ugly sobs that shook her whole body as the reality of her actions and the unexpected mercy being offered crashed over her. I'll do it. I'll do whatever you ask. I just want to understand how I became this person, how I let fear turn me into someone who would do this. And her vulnerability in that moment was so raw that even some of those who had wanted her arrested felt a shift in their hearts. And Pastor Robinson stepped forward again, his voice carrying the authority of moral leadership. This is what redemption looks like. Not easy, not comfortable, but necessary. And he turned to the crowd. How many of us have harbored prejudice in our hearts? Maybe not enough to call the police, but enough to cross the street, enough to clutch our purses, enough to make assumptions. And his words made everyone examine their own hearts, their own fears, their own prejudices, while Officer Chen stepped forward, still crying. Mayor Williams, I want to volunteer at the community center too. I want to be part of the solution. And her declaration started something, with officer after officer stepping forward to commit to community engagement, to building bridges instead of walls. And Marcus felt Jasmine's hand in his, grounding him, in this surreal moment where his wedding had become a movement, where his personal joy had transformed into communal healing. And Margaret looked at the officers, then at the crowd, then back at Marcus. Can I ask one more thing? And Marcus nodded, curious what else she could possibly want. And she said, can I stay for the ceremony? Not as a guest, but as a witness, as someone who needs to see what I almost destroyed, who needs to understand what love looks like when it's not filtered through fear. And the request stunned everyone into silence. The audacity of it, the pain of it, the strange hope of it. And Marcus looked at Jasmine, having a conversation with just their eyes, a lifetime of understanding compressed into a single glance. And Jasmine nodded slightly, and Marcus turned back to Margaret. You can stay, but you sit in the back, you watch, you learn. And you remember that every black wedding, every black birthday party, Every black gathering is just as sacred as any white one, just as worthy of protection, just as deserving of peace. And Margaret nodded, moving to the very last row where she sat alone but surrounded, isolated but included, punished but not destroyed. And as the crowd began to resettle, as the officers found seats among the guests, as the music tentatively began again, something profound had shifted in that garden, something that would ripple out far beyond this day, beyond this city, beyond this moment. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not with violence, but with the radical act of choosing transformation over transaction, education over incarceration, and love over the hate that would destroy it. Pastor Robinson raised his arms to quiet the crowd as the jazz quartet began playing again, the notes floating through the air like prayers of resilience and hope. And Marcus and Jasmine returned to the altar where they had stood what felt like a lifetime ago. But now everything was different, because their wedding had become something larger than themselves, a testament to the power of choosing grace under fire. And as they faced each other again, hands clasped, Marcus could see in Jasmine's eyes not disappointment that their perfect day had been disrupted, but pride that they had turned poison into medicine. And Pastor Robinson began again, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of history and the promise of change. We have witnessed something extraordinary today. Not just the union of two souls, but the possibility of transformation. The proof that love is not weak but the strongest force in the universe. And he looked directly at Margaret Hutchinson sitting in the back row, tears still streaming down her face as she watched what she had tried to destroy blooming before her. Then at the officers scattered throughout the crowd, their uniforms a stark reminder of how close this had come to tragedy. Before returning his gaze to the couple before him, Marcus and Jasmine, your love has already changed this community, has already shown us what courage looks like. So when I ask you to exchange vows, know that you're not just promising to each other, but demonstrating to all of us what commitment to love over fear really means. And Marcus cleared his throat, his voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Jasmine, when I wrote these vows, I thought I was just promising to love you through good times and bad. But today has shown me that our love is bigger than that. It's a force for change, a beacon of hope. And I promise not just to love you, but to stand with you as we love this whole community into something better, something brighter, something that makes little black girls and boys believe they can be mayors too, can have weddings that won't be interrupted by fear, can live in a world where their joy is protected, not suspected. And Jasmine was crying freely now, her makeup running but her beauty shining through even brighter. Marcus, you could have chosen anger today, could have used your power to punish, but instead you chose to teach, to heal, to transform. And that's the man I'm marrying, the leader I'm choosing, the father I want for our children, who will grow up in a world we're making better with every choice, every day, starting with this moment. And as they exchanged rings, the metal circle seemed to carry more weight than gold, seemed to bind not just to people, but 200 witnesses to a new covenant of community. And when Pastor Robinson pronounced them husband and wife, when Marcus kissed Jasmine with all the love and relief and joy and pain of the day pouring into that single moment, the applause that erupted was not just celebration but release. Not just for a wedding, but for a victory over the forces that would divide them. And as they walked back down the aisle, as husband and wife, they stopped at each row, Marcus shaking hands with the officers who had come to arrest his gathering, Jasmine hugging guests who had stood ready to defend their right to joy, until they reached the last row where Margaret Hutchinson sat alone. And Jasmine did something that made everyone gasp. She reached out her hand to the woman who had tried to destroy her wedding. And Margaret looked up in shock, her hand trembling, as she took Jasmine's. And Jasmine said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is how we win. Not by becoming like those who hate us, but by showing them what love looks like, until they can't help but see it." And the moment was captured by photographers who would later say it was the most powerful image they had ever taken. The black bride reaching out to the white woman who had tried to ruin her day. Not with forgiveness exactly, but with the possibility of it. And as the reception began, something magical happened. The officers didn't leave, but stayed. Officer Chen dancing with Marcus's grandmother, who taught her the electric slide, while telling stories of the civil rights movement. Sergeant Meyer, sitting with Marcus's mentors, learning about the real history of policing in black communities. Detective Franklin sharing a drink with the groomsmen, and admitting his own struggles with prejudice in the force. And Margaret Hutchinson sat at her assigned table in the back, watching and learning and beginning to see for the first time in 70 years that everything she had been taught was a lie. That these people were not threats, but teachers, not dangers, but doctors. Not criminals, but community leaders. And as the sun set over Riverside, painting the sky in purples and golds that matched the wedding decorations, Marcus and Jasmine had their first dance to Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." And everyone understood the significance of that choice. The promise embedded in those lyrics, and halfway through the song, something unprecedented happened, as one by one, people began joining them on the dance floor. Not just the wedding party, but the officers, the guests, and finally, even Margaret Hutchinson stood, swaying alone at the edge of the floor, but moving to the same rhythm, part of the same moment, touched by the same hope. And local news crews had arrived, alerted by social media posts that had already gone viral. And they captured not just a story about racism at a wedding, but something more profound. A community choosing to transform trauma into triumph. And Marcus spoke to the cameras, his new wife by his side. "Today we proved that love is not passive, but active. Not weak, but powerful. Not just a feeling, but a choice we make every day to see each other as human. To protect each other's joy. To stand against fear with faith." And within hours the story would spread across the nation, sparking conversations in living rooms and classrooms and police stations about what justice really looked like, what healing could accomplish, what love could build from the ashes of hate. And 3 months later, Margaret Hutchinson would stand before the city council, advocating for police reform and community policing initiatives, her voice shaking but determined as she told the story of the wedding that changed her life, the moment when her fear died and her education began. And she would spend her remaining years volunteering at the community center, teaching computer skills to children who looked nothing like her but who called her Miss Margaret with affection. And Officer Chen would become the department's leading voice for reform, using her story of almost participating in injustice as a teaching tool for new recruits. And Marcus and Jasmine Williams would celebrate their anniversary every year, not just as a couple but with the whole community. The wedding that was almost destroyed by hate, becoming an annual celebration of love's victory over fear. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is not retaliation, but transformation. Not punishment, but education. Not division, but the radical act of coming together. And as their children grew up hearing the story of their parents' wedding day, they understood that love was not just something you felt, but something you fought for. Something you chose even when hate made it hard. Something that could change not just hearts, but history. And in the end, that garden where fear had tried to plant seeds of division became holy ground where love had bloomed instead, proving once and for all that light is always stronger than darkness, that hope is always more powerful than hate, and that love, real love, the kind that chooses grace over grievance and education over retaliation, doesn't just win, it transforms everything it touches.